Peace and blessings, everybody. I got a letter from Daniel Riley today in the P.O. Box. Daniel Riley is incredibly articulate, well educated on the Constitution, history of this country. It's an 11-page letter. If you don't want to hear me read it, you can go to yearofjubilee.com, go to the Ed and Elaine Brown page, scroll down to the Daniel Riley's Patriot Letters, and it's Patriot Letters 2 of 2, and look for Legal Tender is Illegal, and you can download the PDF file and read it yourself. So I'm just going to read it, and we're going to get through this as quick as we can. I have not read it, so here goes. Danbury, Connecticut, December the 7th, 2017. He writes me an introduction letter. He actually writes my wife and I. He says, Aaron and Rudy, here it is, my latest found political letter. I would call it Legal Tender is Illegal. I pray it makes a difference in the public's mind. Any feedback, good or bad, I'd like to read or hear. Feel free to email it to additional people. Maybe both of you know other parties that would be interested in my political writings. Have you been able to get any of my writings to the Bundy Patriots? I would like you to send it to them. I believe the patriots who put their well-being on the line to help or support the Bundys are just as brave and important a patriot as the Bundys themselves. I would like my writings, all of them, if possible. I would like my writings, all of them, if possible, to the Bundy Patriots too. I'm going to get this in the mail tonight, so it goes out Friday. Therefore, I'll end it here, Daniel. So any of you that can help get this to the Bundy Patriots, Daniel would like for them to read his writings. This was a found political letter, which means it was lost, but he found it. It was initially written on May the 31st of 2012. Keep in mind, Daniel has been in prison 10 years. Terre Haute, Indiana. It's written to Donna. With the good Lord's help, this letter may make it to you. My last letter, dated the 30th ultimo, to Mr. Mike back east, was stymied by the enemy. One of the enemy's hirelings sacrificed himself for their cause of tyranny by diving on my last truth grenade. As he dove, I heard him say with cringing hypocrisy, "Your correspondence is being returned to you. The contents of this letter threatens the security and orderly running of the institution and promotes violence." This coming from someone whose employer will have murdered and tortured people in number by the time it takes me to write this correspondence. Is not the truth always a threat to lies? In that sense, maybe my letters are a threat, because the national government is one big lie. Number 5 did not make it to the people as a correspondence, but as in its new role as an evidentiary exhibit. I feel confident the people will eventually get to read it, for such is the irresistible nature of truth that all it asks and all it wants is the liberty of appearing, something the enemy wants no part of, knowing the danger once the nation comes to its senses. Upon reflection, myself and other prisoners exposed an attempt by a very unscrupulous hireling to cover up the fact that his informant on the unit thrashed a prisoner who exposed this informant to the rest of the prisoners on the unit by striking him about the head with a wood stock of a industrial push broom. I witnessed the attack. For me, helping to expose the cover-up staff was carrying out to protect their informant, I was immediately retaliated against, losing the use of email for 60 days, for telling the truth. This event, coupled with these truth grenades, has the staff handlers of this communications management unit hating me. The best they are able to do is hide their hostility behind a mask of courtesy. This past week, I sustained another attack provoked by retaliation, being fired from a work detail without reason. I was told this at first, but now, since I have made a claim of retaliation, the enemy's playful imagination has invented a cover story so ridiculous to justify firing me. That common sense and reason must bite their lip to stop from breaking out in stentorian laughter. Due to the despotic nature of the enemy's hirelings who directly control my internment, I am left without a source to supply the credit I need to get by. With an embarrassed spirit, I come forward and ask my fellow countrymen and women to donate directly to my commissary account. I believe there is no explanation needed for what the credit will be used for, but I will assure my readers that I will be as frugal as humanly possible. I figure if a decent amount of people... Hold on just one second. Where are we at? I figure if a decent amount of people could each spare a few Federal Reserve notes without causing pain to their financial situation, together it would make a tremendous difference to my wretched life. To all, whether you donate or not, I thank you for just simply taking your time to read this correspondence. I'll leave it to Donna and my brother Bill to inform people how to donate to me. Enough on this, let's move on. The fundamental topic I wish to investigate with my readers is legal tender. What is it? What is its origin? What is its objective justification? These are some of the questions I hope to answer to my readers' satisfaction in the following pages by offering nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. We can all admit tender is just another word for payment, and legal simply means it is justified by the law. Thus, legal tender means lawful payment. But before man's law declared what was tender, the law of nature declared what man's inherent nature to follow her laws. With man's inherent nature to follow her laws, that gold and silver were money. The technical definition of money as found in the 2005 Encyclopedia Britannica is money, a commodity accepted by general consent as a medium of economic exchange. It is a medium to which prices and values are expressed. It circulates from person to person and country to country, thus facilitating trade, and it is the principal measure of wealth. From what I said so far, we can deduce that money is always legal tender, but legal tender is not always money. Money does not need a law to force someone to accept it as tender. Money is accepted by consent without law for its intrinsic value, meaning the money itself has worth from its natural state of being. History's first recording of legal tender law was denoted in Marco Polo's writings from his trip to the Far East in the 13th century. The emperor of the Mongols, Kublai Khan, using a method believed to originate with Genghis Khan, forced the people to accept dried and pressed tree bark with the tyrant's emperor's seal in red ink in lieu of money. The force used to make the people accept the worthless tree bark was that you would be killed if did not accept it as tender. The advantage this bestowed upon the tyrant needs no explanation. A fact is, legal tender is intrinsically worthless, and you are forced to accept it. By contrast, money has value, and you voluntarily consent to accept it, which is a big difference as between freedom and despotism. Before I discuss the Supreme Court cases concerning the Legal Tender Act, I want to make a few observations. The Supreme Court is not supreme. There are two higher courts, the People's Court and the Court of Public Awareness, or Opinion, as some call it, where the general will of the people is the predominant authority, which has not only the authority to change the laws, but also the form of government itself. And the Most High Court, Almighty God's judgment and His laws as expressed by the ways of nature. We must not confuse the people with their government. The people come together to form a society by their wants, promoting happiness by uniting their affections and interest. Because of the inability of moral virtue to govern the people in society, rendered the origin, necessity, and design and end of government, that is to say freedom and security, government is a product of our wickedness. Its object is to restrain our vices. Society encourages intercourse, trade, commerce, etc., while government creates distinctions. The former is a patron, the latter is a punisher. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable evil. When we suffer or are exposed to the same miseries by a government, which we might expect in a country without a government, our calamity is heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. First and foremost, the people existed in their inherent sovereignty in a state of nature. Then naturally, through interaction amongst the people, a society was formed. Then the people then constituted an ordinance to form a government. This ordinance or authoritative decree is known as a constitution, and a government is a creature of the Constitution. The Constitution is not the act of government, but the people acting in their sovereign capacity. Only the people have the authority to change or abolish the Constitution. This ordinance delegates and trusts some of the people's inherent sovereign power to the government to supply a remedy for the defect of moral virtue inherent in society. Or in other words, there is always a scofflaw bent on doing wrong. With these observations in mind, let us look at how legal tender came about in America. During the War for Southern Independence, I don't believe it should be called a civil war, because that is a war between people of the same country vying for control over the same government, like we currently see in Libya. To use the term civil war is a misnomer. Congress on February the 2nd, 1862, July the 11th, 1862, and March 3rd, 1863, passed acts making evidence of the national debt legal tender for all transactions, meaning lawful money for all debts, public and private, within the United States. At the time of the passage of the first act, Salmon P. Chase was the Secretary of Treasury, who told Congress he believed declaring Treasury notes to be legal tender was unconstitutional, and that such a declaration was unnecessary. The Congress agreed with the Secretary of the Treasury, but due to the necessity of the circumstances, passed the Legal Tender Act anyways, with the idea of redeeming the greenbacks as they became known as in dollars after the war was over. On a side note, during the congressional debates on June 22, 1834, pages 4650, 4652, and 4653, Congress admitted they have no constitutional authority to make a legal tender. By July 1864, the greenbacks depreciated 65% to 35 cents per dollar. This follows the law of nature. Whenever paper currency is not directly and immediately at the mere will of the holder redeemable in gold or silver, is and forever must be liable to consent depreciation. As a necessary consequence, creditors were being plundered by being forced to accept depreciated paper as its face value in lieu of real money. In the meantime, on April 12, 1866, Congress passed the act to retire all legal tender notes. All legal tender notes, but did an about-face on February 4, 1868. Over President Johnson's veto, and the national government stopped redeeming and retiring the notes. In December 1867, Hepburn v. Griswold, 8 Wall 603, 1870, was argued at the Supreme Court and re-argued in 1868 with 5 other cases on the same question. Are the Legal Tender Acts constitutional? In a 5, Salmon, Chase, now Chief Justice Clifford, Field, Grier, and Nelson to 3, Miller, Davis, and Swain decision, the question was answered in the negative. This confirmed the court's previous decision in Ogden v. Saunders, 12 Wheat 213, 1827, where Justice Bushrod, Washington, said Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, and Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 established a policy that was to provide a fixed and uniform standard of value throughout the United States. Justice William Johnson said in the same case that the Constitution prohibits anything but gold and silver, and a tender in payment of debts is express and universal, at 288. The framers of the Constitution regarded it, paper money, as an evil to be repelled without modification, and that they therefore left nothing to be inferred or deduced from construction, meaning implication on the subject. At 288, and in Gwynn v. Breedlove, 2, how 29/1841, by the Constitution of the United States, gold and silver coin made current by law can only be tendered in payment of debts, at 38, and United States v. Marigold, 9, how HOW 560/1850, the court, speaking of the trust and duty of maintaining a uniform and pure metallic standard of uniform value throughout the Union, said, the powers of coining money and regulating its value was delegated to Congress by the Constitution for the very purpose as assigned by the framers of that instrument, of creating and preserving the uniformity and purity of such a standard of value at 567. Here is where it gets interesting. If we examine with attention the following facts, it is evident, at least to me, the Supreme Court's composition was manipulated with the specific intent to revive the despotic principle of legal tender. Remember Hepburn was argued in 1867 and 1868 and was decided on November 27, 1869, and the opinion was read in open court on February 7, 1870. They used to read all opinions in open court back then. Over 2 years of research, reasoning, and reflection went into deciding Hepburn. There was a total of 8 justices on the court at the time Hepburn was decided. On July 23, 1866, Congress passed an Act, 14 Statute at Large 209, reducing the number of justices to 7. But on April 10, 1869, Congress reversed itself. Instead of letting the number fall to 7, Congress increased it to 9. It may be with reasonable plausibility be said that Congress, like a heroin addict, was addicted to forcing their worthless paper promises on the people, and knowing behind the scenes that Supreme Court had killed their fix, immediately began on a program. Oh, excuse me for yawning, it's just tough. Began on a program to get Hepburn overturned. At 75 years old and 24 years on the bench, Justice Grier retired in February 1870. Instead of having no vacancies to fill, the Act of April 10, 1869, and this retirement left 2 vacancies to be filled by that reprobate President Grant. Like a political physician, Grant appointed 2 yes-men for legal tender Justices Strong and Bradley. The 5-man majority in Hepburn, with the loose loss of Grier, became 4, and the 3-man minority became the majority of 5, with the addition of Strong and Bradley. The intrigue was complete. The enemies of liberty went to work immediately to overthrow Hepburn. The executive branch requested a re-arguing of the legal tender question over the dissent of Justice Field, Nelson, and Clifford. With 80 years of precedent on their side, the Supreme Court granted a re-argument, which is extremely rare. The cases used to re-argue the constitutionality of legal tender acts were Knox v. Lee and Parker v. Davis, 79 U.S. 457, 1871. Justice Strong applied the poison drawn from horrid principles, if they can even be referred to as principles, in his opinion for the majority of the court, summing up the reasons given by the court to justify the constitutionality of legal tender. 1. Absolute necessity for self-preservation of the government during the war. 2. The authority is not clearly and directly traceable to any one of the specified enumerated powers, but its existent authority is found by combining enumerated powers. First time this principle was ever conceived. 3. The Legal Tender Acts do not attempt to make paper a standard of value, thus it will not interfere with the regulation of value. Besides, value is a subjective ideal thing. And 4. Congress's power of inherent sovereignty. Whoever can calmly hear and digest such false doctrine has forfeited his claim to sanity. Absolute necessity. Necessity is a fury who knows no law, as was the case here. Immediate necessity, oh how it makes many things convenient, and when such things are continued, most often grow into oppressions, as is the case here. For self-preservation in the face of war, self-preservation is a natural right of all living things. First, the government is an artificial entity, so it has no right to self-preservation. And second, government is altogether a trust in right of those by whom the trust is delegated and by whom it is always the right to take back the delegation. Government has of itself no rights. It has no duties and obligations, and it has no duty or obligation to circumvent the Constitution, only to abide by it at all times. Moreover, isn't the Constitution itself the same in peace as it is in war? After the majority admits that no specific enumerated power is directly related to the incidental power to declare a legal tender, they go on to concoct a new combination of powers doctrine. This is the doctrine of despotism. It allows a nefarious scheme to mix and match and blend powers, credulous mind of the people. Blend powers till till the corrupt judges can find a recipe where they are able to sell to the credulous mind of the people that the desired power can be declared to exist incidentally of the recipe. Another thought to consider is the exclusion of the eccentric notion of paper promises as legal tender for the period of 85 years since the adoption of the Constitution is surely long enough to have enabled the advocates of paper money to discover its locality and point out its home in the Constitution. Thus strong evidence surfaces in the concurrence with those whose conscience and convictions have led them to conclude that the Constitution prohibits paper promises as legal tender. Turning paper promises into legal tender has not only interfered with the standard of value, it has completely destroyed it. I will go into this subject in more detail in the following pages, but for now I will state that value cannot be measured without a standard any more than time or duration or length or solidity or volume or weight or gravity or quantity. Something in every such case must be adopted as a unit which bears a known relation to that which is to be measured, as the dollar for values, the hour for time or duration, and the foot for length, the yard for fabric, the square foot for surface, the cubic foot for solidity, the gallon for volume, the pound for weights, and the pound troy for weighing gold and silver and other precious stones, except diamonds, just to name a few standards to give my reader the idea of how important a standard unit is. Today we have no fixed standard with which to measure value. We have a constant fluctuating standard based on the paper promise, commonly referred to as a dollar, which is a misnomer. And the final substantive reason given to justify the enemy's legal tender scheme, the inherent sovereignty of the government, Congress can exercise no power by virtue of any supposed inherent sovereignty in the national government. Indeed, it may be doubted whether the power can be correctly said to belong as a rightful part or privilege appertaining to sovereignty in any proper sense, as an attribute of an independent government or political community. The power to commit violence, perpetrate injustice, and take private property by force without compensation to the owner, and compel the receipt of paper promises to pay in place of real money may be exercised, as it often has been, by irresponsible authority, but it cannot be considered as belonging to a government founded upon law. But be that as it may, there is no such thing as a power of inherent sovereignty in the government of the United States. To say otherwise is to manufacture a falsehood tending to muddle up and confuse the powers of an unlimited sovereignty, such as a dictator with those of a constitutional government founded on an organized written ordinance of the people. This is supposed to be a government of delegated powers, supreme within its prescribed sphere, but powerless outside of it. In this country, all power and sovereignty resides in the people. Can I get an amen? Amen. And the people did not delegate the power to declare a legal tender, but did just the opposite, declared gold and silver the only legal tender allowed in the United States. See U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1. At first glance, the Supreme Court's opinion overthrowing its prior opinions that declared legal tender laws unconstitutional may not present itself as despotism on the first reflection. But if Americans will permit a second reflection to take place and carry that reflection forward, you will then see the true absurdity of the Knox opinion. Together, let's reflect a little more. In the ranking of the prolific nature of all powers that can be granted to a limited constitutional government, legal tender laws ranks up there equal to taxation. To think the Founding Fathers purposely failed to expressly or explicitly grant it, relying instead for it to be found through compounded implication with incidentalness, requires a belief from us to which our reason cannot subscribe. Matter of fact, by a vote of 9-2, each state got one vote. Only 11 states were represented at the Constitutional Convention, which I am no fan of. The power of legal tender was specifically rejected. A synopsis of the discussion concerning legal tender at the convention is attached here too, to bring this point home. I believe we can all agree authority exists in Congress to pass laws providing for the issuance of Treasury notes based upon the national credit as a necessary and proper means to fulfill the end of the express power to borrow money. The power to borrow money includes the power to give evidence of indebtedness and obligations of repayment. The government, in substance, says to parties with whom it deals, lend us your money or furnish us with your products or your labor, and we will ultimately pay you, and as evidence of it, we will give you our promissory note in such form and amounts as we suit your convenience, and enable you to transfer, negotiate them, and we will also receive them as tender for duties, taxes, and all public exactions required to be paid into the national treasury. In this matter, there is only a dealing between the government and the individual creditor who trust it. The transaction concerns no others. The quality of being able to pay obligations owed to the government and their eventual redemption in real money gave the notes a desirable ability to be negotiated to whomever voluntarily consented to accept them at par from the government's creditor. In this aspect, they lawfully circulated as credit currency. The Supreme Court also stated in the Knox decision that legal tender power was incidental to the implied power of issuing Treasury notes. The court plies implication upon incident. The court plies implication upon incident upon inference in such a mode of reasoning on such subject as to be inadmissible. Besides carrying the doctrine of implied powers beyond any extent, it is the utter destruction of all limitation of power in the national government. The only limit on the national government's power now, unfortunately, is Congress's discretion. We were warned by the great patriot Patrick Henry when he stated in June of 2007. When he stated on June 7th, 1788, that implication is dangerous because it is unbounded. If it be admitted at all and no limits be prescribed, it admits of the utmost extension. Those who parrot that the Constitution constituted a limited government deceived you and probably themselves too. In a letter to Eldridge, Gary, and Rufus King, Samuel Adams stated the Constitution is dangerous and unnecessary. It requires but a very small glance of thought to perceive that these two founding fathers knew the Constitution's cunning scheme to form a government not out of the people, but over the people, being well versed in the natural propensity that governments in their operation invariably disturb society or destroy it by enslaving the people. The issuance of Treasury notes operates and serves the honest purposes they were intended for without the force of legal tender. The legal tender quality is only valuable for the purpose of dishonesty. When money, gold, or silver is transferred in satisfaction of debt, not only is the debt canceled as between the parties, but it is absolutely paid. The creditor receives in hand the actual amount of his claim. But when a Treasury note is transferred, the process merely substitutes the government as the debtor. The creditor is still unpaid. The notes promise on their face to pay money. A promise is not the same as the thing promised. If it were, then the government could pay in a second slip of paper printed in the same form, and this latter again with another, so that in fact it never promises to pay anything beyond swapping one slip of paper for another exactly similar. This factual scenario that I just clearly presented to you, your understanding should allow you to discern the absolute absurdity and the repugnance to human wisdom, which the quality of legal tender has brought to our monetary policy. It's dishonest, and we are compelled to support the very fraud that oppresses us, compelled by the fact that once a Treasury note is tendered, the national courts hold that the debt is paid. To further underscore the lunacy that has been foisted on the people by the enemy's government, they want us to rationally believe that giving to the promise the name of the thing promised makes it the thing promised. Just calling a Federal Reserve note $1 doesn't make it $1. Congress, to further promote their despotic scheme, made a law which clearly has the intention to deceive, 12 U.S.C. subsection 411, that Federal Reserve notes shall be redeemed in lawful money on demand. In 2017, I learned that this law pertains to Federal Reserve note banks only when they deal amongst each other. Mr. Milam, having been deceived, tried to redeem the paper promise for gold or silver money, only to be rebuked by the enemy's bank. Mr. Milam sued the enemy's government and lost. The Court of Appeals ruled Federal Reserve notes are redeemable for Federal Reserve notes because Federal Reserve notes are lawful money. C. William versus U.S. 542 F.2D 629, 9th Circuit, 1974. It is easy to see how this vicious system is repugnant to reason and common sense. It's nonsense, for it deserves no better name. And in its operation, it amounts to a public justification of corruption. What greater public curse can befall any country than to be under such a wretched scheme? And what greater blessing to be delivered from it? The greatest yet simple observation for the mind of the nation to arrive at the perfect decision that legal tender is applied despotism is that no one has the right to force another to accept payment in a medium that they do not want. In other words, A wants to purchase a beautiful painting that B is selling for $20 in silver. A does not have the $20 in silver and B will not take credit. A offers 100 pounds of freshly made flour, but B refuses. Does A have the right to force B to accept the flour as tender? Of course not. Does a group, no matter how large or small, have a right to force someone to accept their unwanted tender? Of course not. Therefore, it must be admitted that the people do not possess the right of legal tender, and therefore could never have delegated it to the government. Page 7. I dwell not upon the powers of imagination, I bring reason to your ears, and in a language as plain as ABC hold up truth to your eyes. Do we need a stronger evidence of the absurdity of legal tender? By nature, legal tender is not a human right, and therefore cannot have been a power that was delegated to Congress. It's a myth, fraud, only applicable to despotic and tyrannical governments. Some of the effects of legal tender law: it allows the government to be involved in all transactions, depriving the society of its private nature, to contract privately without the government being the middleman. There can only be one legal tender that is voluntarily accepted by all. Gold and silver for thousands of years had the voluntary universal consent for this purpose, and once people were forced to accept irredeemable paper promises, this necessarily operated to drive gold and silver from circulation, causing hoarding. Thus, in the 1930s, the national government outlawed hoarding and forced the nation to surrender all their money, gold and silver, in exchange for paper promises. There is no longer a fixed standard of value. Legal tender laws nullified this aspect of the Constitution, leaving the people with a standard of value that fluctuates in substance from day to day, with every pulse on the news or talk from the Treasury Secretary. Imagine if a foot became 11 inches tomorrow, and the confusion and scheming that would follow. I believe my reader gets the point. One quick refutation of the necessity to quickly raise money to prosecute the war as a justification for legal tender, when the sovereign people already delegated to Congress to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises without limitation as to amount, to borrow money also without limitation, and to coin money, sell public lands, and to appropriate all monies that come into the public's treasury. With all these avenues of revenue, to argue without the power to make paper promises a legal tender would be to cripple the government, is a mere foolish fancy without any solid constitutional foundation for its support. In 1862, when the first Legal Tender Act was passed, as it is today, all Treasury notes are issued at par value with the dollar. Here I want to state my opinion as concisely as I can. With regards to intrinsic value stored in gold and silver versus the purchasing power contained in paper promises, remember $1 paper is supposed to equal $1 silver. But first I ask my reader, what is a dollar? If you cannot answer that, do not feel out of place. Most Americans probably cannot. A dollar is a unit used to measure value, like an inch is a unit to measure length. On October the 10th, 1786, the Confederation Congress set the unit of a dollar at 371.25 grains of pure fine silver, or 416 grains of standard silver. This was the reference point all other measurements were derived from. The ratio of silver to gold was set at 15:1. This ratio was changed to keep their values in proper proportion during the mid-19th century to 16:1. Let us use the language of God mathematics. It never lies. Ever to see just how much purchasing power is left in a Federal Reserve note, meaning to see how much the people have been plundered? The ratio is now set by Congress at 50 to 1, and Congress has defined a dollar as 1 troy ounce of pure silver in a U.S. coin. The world market sets the price of 1 troy ounce of silver around 30 paper promises, also known as Federal Reserve notes. Troy weight: 1 pound equals 12 ounces. 1 ounce is 480 grains, or 31 grams in terms of silver. $1 paper equals $1 silver, but due to the depreciation of the paper dollar, it now takes 30 paper dollars to buy the same amount of silver that 1 paper dollar used to. This means there has been 3,000% increase or inflation since legal tender paper promises came in par in 1862. This means paper promises to give you $1 of silver for $1 of paper only buys 1/30th of what it used to. Stated differently, the paper promises have lost 96.7% of its purchasing power, leaving you with 3.3% of its original purchasing power. The enemy's government, in collusion with the international banking cabal, has plundered our wealth, our labor and wealth, all because paper promises have been foisted on we the people, against the trust and delegated authority we gave to the national government. This is the equivalent to a financial holocaust, and the American people are the victims. If it is written on a piece of paper, it's worth the paper. If it is written on a piece of paper, it's worth the paper it's written on. Furthermore, the simple fact that the government had to force their paper promises on us by declaring them legal tender should enable the reader to discern that the promise was never intended to be kept. It virtually declares that it does not expect to be received without compulsion. It practically represents itself insolvent. It's all a promise of a lie. In sum, a legal tender is tantamount to forcing someone to take a payment of a medium that they may not want. We know paper money being forced on people originated with a despotic tyrant in the Far East. We know the National Supreme Court properly declared paper promises as legal tender unlawful, but through stacking the Supreme Court overthrew the people's prerogative as declared in the previous proper decisions. We know there is no objective justification for such a hideous scheme as paper promises as de facto money, except for the dishonest plundering of the working men and women. Does a free people deserve irredeemable paper promises as a storage unit for their labor, considering the vast vicissitudes and perpetual fluctuations, along with its never-ending depreciation? We threw off the yoke of the king because he taxed us without our consent. Nothing lawful can be done to any free man or woman without their consent. We, the people, never consented to accepting irredeemable paper promises for our private obligations. To do so would be insane. Instead, we are compelled by force of law, a law we never delegated the power for, to have been imposed on us. It's déjà vu. We are being compelled to surrender our earnings through inflation via legal tender paper promises and forced to use a medium of exchange. We all neither consented to nor want. Preclusion of consent is tyranny. All power exercised over the people must have some beginning. It must be delegated or assumed. There are no other sources. All delegated power is trust, and all assumed power is usurpation. Legal tender is an assumed power. As both the Knox and Hepburn court said and agreed, there is no express or implied delegation to make Treasury notes legal tender, but instead relied on the tyrannical doctrine of necessity. Thus we have an assumed power without our consent. If that is not despotism, then what is? With each of my political letters, I intend to bring into view the conspiracy against the people, to break down the common mystery by perspicuously explaining so my reader can understand how he or she is being enslaved by degrees, and that my readers may acquire knowledge of their natural and civil rights, so they can attend justly to their interest and discover that the strength and powers of despotism consist wholly in the fear of resisting it, and that in order to regain our lost freedom we must will it together united. On a parting note, Justice Bradley, in his concurring opinion for legal tender implied that it was only a temporary thing, stated, "No one supposes that these government certificates are never to be paid, that the day of specie, gold and silver, is never to return. Their government notes ultimate destiny is to be paid." At 561 through 62. Well, it's been 141 years since Justice Bradley wrote that, and I have yet to see a single paper promise be redeemed for gold or silver. Donna, this correspondence is for immediate posting on as many websites as you can get it posted. There does not exist in the bounds of language and arrangement of words to express how much I appreciate the work you do, not only for me, but more importantly for liberty. I encourage all readers of any of my political letters, if you like what I am saying, I exhort you to feel free to copy and post it on your blog, website, Facebook, or whatever the site may be. If so, I thank you in advance. I believe men and women who are sincere in defending their freedoms will always feel concern at every circumstance which seems to attack them. It's a natural and honest consequence of all affectionate attachments, and the lack of such concern is a vice. Paper promises as legal tender. This poison for a cure is very dangerous doctrine. If not, the number one object that our principles tell us must be repealed, for it is the very foundational weapon our enemies are using to destroy us and our beloved country. The repeal of this horrid pestilence appears to me practicable and probable, provided the sentiment of the nation can be formed and held to the object. With that, I end by simply saying, take good care. He's also got two additional pieces of paper in here that appears to be from some sort of case law. This will be in the letter. If you want to look at the additional two pieces of exhibits, you can go to yearofjubilee.com and look for the Ed and Elaine Brown page, and then look for Daniel Riley's letter called "Legal Tender is Illegal." Thank you for your time.